I'm going to take this opportunity to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at the Center for South Asian Studies. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Farina Mir. I'm the director of the center. And I'd like to welcome you to the Trehan Theme Years Environment of India Conference Part 2. And for those of you who are, I know some of you are actually lucky enough to be here for both of these parts. I thought I would just take a moment and give you some sense of, very briefly, what Part 1 was about. That first conference was held in March of this year, and just as today, we had 3 outside speakers join us, and they were Professor Anne Gold, who spoke on mythology and ecology of a minor river in Rajasthan, and that was a talk focusing on the use of water resources in a semi-arid setting. Professor Ashwini Chhatre spoke on the relationship between meeting the needs of rural people, politically and, I think, otherwise, and the sustenance of natural systems. And the inimitable Mahesh Rangarajan was here talking about both history and politics. Mahesh is a good friend. I was sorry to have missed that talk. And he spoke to us about the political imperatives that impact the conservation of resources in India today. And being on some significant task forces, he has a real insider's perspective on those issues. So it's very nice that the conversation today, I think, will be continuing some of these themes and also pushing in new directions. So we look forward to continuing our discussion on the environment in India today. I want to take a moment to just thank some very important people who helped make this possible. I would like to thank Ranveer and Adarsh Trehan for their generous support, which has made these conferences, and indeed, this is the 3rd of our theme years, possible. I'd also like to thank Zilka Joseph, our program manager, who has coordinated the efforts today. And last but not least, I want to thank Richard Tucker for organizing this conference. And I will actually, at this point, turn the floor over to him to introduce our guests and welcome everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Farina. Thanks to everybody for being here this afternoon. And if you've decided that you bought one of the inexpensive seats and would like to be farther up front in the more expensive seats, then feel free to move forward at this point. I know that with the richness of the program going on campus today, as usual, and with the heavy pressures on everyone's time late in the semester, there will be people coming and going. Only the select, privileged few of us are going to be here for the whole afternoon. So feel free to be moving back and forth or front and back. The hot water for tea is over there. And let me add my thanks to Farina for reminding us of the very remarkable day we had here last March with the first half of this year's conference on environmental issues and challenges in India. The richness of all of that in this calendar year is even greater, as I'm sure most of you know, because our Friday weekly lecture series here in September started out with Dilipta Kunya's marvelous discussion of the hydrology of the Indian subcontinent, in which he is a very leading specialist. And then, speaking of leading specialists, just about a month ago, Raman Sukumar from Bangalore was here to talk. He's undoubtedly India's leading specialist on as a wildlife biologist, but focusing on elephants, elephant ecology, and the interaction, practical and cultural, between humans and elephants. And so it's very good to have at least a touch of South India again before we're finished this afternoon. I don't know, there may be something of that old familiar bias in the course of the year that out of the 6 visiting speakers, only one is South Indian. But that'll be enough to balance the budget. We have no Bengalis, and it occurred to us this morning, how did that happen? it used to be that we would start with Bengalis, but here we are. We can't do everything for the incredible richness and variety of the subcontinent, even in a 12-month period. Let me introduce each of the speakers as his and then her and then his hour comes up. We'll have till about 3 now for Mark Baker's presentation, and then brief comments and questions, and then we move to Shubhra Gururani's talk for the second hour, and at around 4 o'clock we'll take 20 minutes or so for the break, for the sweets, and then finally the talk on Indian toxicology before a final half hour at around 5:30 of discussion among the three of them, and then we can all jump in. So let me begin with Mark Baker. I'm totally delighted. I first met him when he was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz back in the 80s. He went on from there to Berkeley for his PhD in forestry, forest and water and related resources, and is now tenured at Cal State in Humboldt in Arcata, and in the process of pulling together all of the various resources on the Humboldt campus into an integrated undergraduate environmental studies program. So we spent some fair amount of time this morning comparing how it's going there at Humboldt with how it has gone now for the 10-year history of the PIKE program, the program in the environment here at U of M. And that was one of many pleasures for me this morning. Mark ended up coming to the same corner of the Western Himalayas in Himachal Pradesh, where I have been working and living part-time. So we've been watching each other's work very closely for these last 20 years or so. Let me give just a slight bit of context and then turn it over to him. In the 70s, if you went trekking or exploring through the Western Himalayas, Kumaon, Garhwal, Himachal, Jammu, there wasn't very much development infrastructure to get in your way. And in terms of the health of the natural ecosystems in those fragile mountain regions, it was still quite glorious. But the pressures, mostly from the south, have had an enormous impact on that region over the last 20 or 30 years. And by the early 90s, I began to see plans for one hydro dam after another throughout all of the rivers of Himachal, and the state government in Shimla, well aware that this could become the single most important source of income for the state government. And on it goes, on it goes. I'm going to turn it over to Mark to bring you up to date on the story. But first, as it happens, the only book published by any of these that I actually own is Mark's first book, The Cools of Kangra, Community Managed Irrigation in the Western Himalaya. A marvelous thing, so I'll leave it right here for anyone who'd like to take a look at it, but don't take it home. His work, just one other footnote, his work at Humboldt is also focused on community forest management, both in Northern California and elsewhere around the western states, and by comparison with North India. So his focus as our major specialist on the water resources and management or mismanagement of them in the Western Himalayas, that's complemented by his work on community forests. Mark.
Thank you, Richard, for that very generous introduction. As Richard noted, we first met at UC Santa Cruz back in the mid-'80s, and I was working as an undergrad student assistant for my Indian history professor, Dilip Basu, helping to organize a conference, and that's where I met Richard, and I was very impressed because he was one of the few conference participants who was concerned with the applied and practical implications of his research. And I think that's something that has informed my work throughout my career, to be focusing on applied issues of relevance. Perhaps applied scholarship might be another term for describing them. It's certainly an honor to be here today, to be able to participate in the second Environment in India conference. I want to thank the Trehan India Initiative for enabling this, and also for Zilka for providing such good support, and for the invitation to come here. Today I'm going to share with you the results of 6 months of field research that I conducted January through June in Himachal Pradesh earlier this year. This is the first opportunity I've had to, unlike some of my colleagues like Kannan, who has a 1 class per year teaching load at Humboldt State, we have a little heavier teaching load, and I haven't had as much time to engage with the information that I collected as perhaps I would have liked to. So think of this as a preliminary cut, and I welcome your contributions and suggestions with respect to how I'm framing this material and other insights that you might be able to offer. Let me go ahead and get this in slide mode, and to the first slide. Believe it or not, there are approximately 150 slides in this PowerPoint. There's a lot of photographs that I'm going to use to walk us through the presentation. So you can see here the title. What I was grappling with during this research were the local livelihood, social, and environmental impacts of small-scale hydropower development, which is occurring through a privatized modality where private independent power producers are constructing, managing, and selling to the state of Himachal Pradesh electricity through small-scale hydropower. And the purpose here is to understand this as a manifestation of India's embrace of neoliberalization, private power production, to look at the social and environmental impacts of that embrace using small-scale hydro in the Western Himalaya as a case study, and to broaden back and raise some questions about, well, what are the concerns and challenges with this approach to power generation? What are the limitations and what are the possibilities? I have several key questions that I'd like to review with you now. So what are small-scale run-of-the-river hydropower projects? Do they represent clean, sustainable forms of electricity production, as proponents claim? Number 2, what is the relationship between the government of Himachal Pradesh's program of privatized power generation through small hydropower projects and the neoliberal regime of governance that was initiated in India in the early 1990s? 3, what are the actual local environmental and social impacts of those projects in Himachal? And then lastly, what can we learn from Himachal's experience with privatized small hydropower generation about the more general possibilities and challenges of neoliberal approaches to natural resources and the environment in India? So those are the broad framing questions that I will be engaging with over the next 40 minutes or so. Let's take a look at what we mean when we talk about small run-of-the-river hydropower projects. This is a signboard that gives a little bit of an idealized schematic for what we're talking about here. So let's run through this schematic, and then I'll show you some photographs that illuminate these different elements. And is the lighting okay? Can you see adequately? And okay, so we start up here with a diversion weir, and then we carry the water through to a desilting tank, which allows the silt in the water to drop to the bottom. Then the water is conveyed through what is often thought of as a power channel across to a forebay, and here the water is collected and then shot down through a very steep pipe called a penstock and enters the powerhouse, where it drives 1 or 2 turbines, usually Pelton wheels, generates electricity, which is carried off through the evacuation system. And after generating that electricity, the water comes out of the powerhouse and is returned to the source stream through the tail race. So that's the generic schematic diagram of what these small-scale hydropower projects look like. Let's take a look at a few photos of what we mean. Here is the weir. So usually we have a trench weir, and it's basically a conduit constructed across the stream into which the water flows, and then from there moves down through this power channel. And here we have the desilting tanks. There's usually 2, so that you use use them both, and then when you need to clean the silt out of one, you direct the flow into the other and then flush the silt, and we'll talk more about the ecological effects of that silt flushing later on. Then here the water continues on through this power channel. In this case, it's a concrete box. Sometimes it's a huge pipe, and here it enters the hill, so it is tunneled through the hill. And here's another example of the main power channel coming through the landscape. And here's another example of a power channel, in this case quite elevated. And there's a scale, me in terms of the size of this power channel. And the power channel moves through inhabited landscapes, apple orchards, villages and houses. It's a big pipe. That's my young son, Devin, 8 years old, who was with me on that day. Underneath houses through this water. And then we see here, this is the forebay, and it's dropped down through the penstock. And this penstock, in this case, is coming through an apple orchard in Kulu, again down through village settled areas, and then dropping down into the powerhouse itself. In this case, quite steep, challenging terrain. Into the powerhouse, here we have 2 intake pipes driving 2 Pelton turbines, and then a series of power banks that control the power generation and track and monitor the flow of power. And then there's the tail race in the water being returned to the source stream. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the power that is generated. After it's generated, is then evacuated through power lines. And the power that we're talking about here is not for local consumption. It's that it is plugged into the national grid, and the small hydropower producer is responsible for conveying the power that they produce from the point of generation across to the nearest substation of the state electricity board. And that is anywhere from 3 to 12 or 15 kilometers away. Okay, so there are a wide variety of claims made about small-scale hydropower, that it is clean, green, and sustainable. And the claims that are made in the discourse surrounding small-scale power is that there's no water impoundments, there's no land loss due to inundation, the water is returned to the source stream, there's minimal disruption of flora and fauna, there's no submerged settlements, no displaced communities that need to be resettled, and that it's a sustainable and renewable form of energy. And in fact, it qualifies for the generation of carbon credits under the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. So that's the discourse around small hydro in general. And small hydro in India really took off in terms of a series of pilot projects in the mid-90s through a program that was developed through a collaboration between the central government of India and the Global Environmental Facility and United Nations Development Program, UNDP. They created a project called the Hilly Hydel Project. And the goals of this project were to demonstrate the potential for this technology. And there were a lot of lofty ideals associated with this demonstration project. The projects themselves were to be distributed across the Himalayan belt from Himachal across to West Bengal, Sikkim, and actually include part of Bihar as well down further south. And it was thought that this would be environmentally sound, people-centered development, that it would help reduction in deforestation. The idea was that people will stop using fuel wood for cooking and instead shift to electricity as a fuel source, and that thereby biodiversity would be protected. There would be a reduction of rural to urban migration because of the employment generation capacity of these projects, and also a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because one is burning rather than burning coal, one is using hydropower. And this was implemented through the Ministry of Non-Conventional Energy Sources. And several of these were developed in Himachal Pradesh. So that was the sort of first splashdown, if you will, of small hydro in India. And it occurred in this project from 1995 to 2003. Let's take a look at Himachal Pradesh, where I was focusing on this research. And just some general information about it. It's a moderately populated state, about 6.8 million. It contains the headwaters of 3 key rivers that flow down in the Punjab, the Ravi, the Beas, and the Sutlej. There's relatively minimal industrialization in the state, although there is some adjacent to the plains. Agriculture in the state is primarily subsistence-oriented, although there is some market components of agriculture as well. That tends to be stone fruit production in Kulu and Samor and Kannur districts, and I'll show you a map in a little bit with those districts. Off-season vegetable production or vegetable seed production. But primarily agriculture is subsistence-based, and families cannot reproduce themselves through subsistence ag, so there's a very strong pattern of non-farm migration, either to urban centers in the state or else down to the plains. And almost it's uncommon to find a household that doesn't have one wage earner out of the area who has migrated for work and is sending remittances back to households and to support the household back in the rural area. And it's important that one thinks of the subsistence and wage labor sectors as entirely interdependent. Neither are subsistence economies sufficient to reproduce households, nor are wages earned in urban areas sufficient for reproducing livelihoods and families. But there's a subsidy of urban wages by subsistence agriculture. So this is a pretty strong pattern of what we see in Himachal as well. There's also a significant tourism in parts of the state, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, well, there's my slide. I just talked about these points. The other thing I didn't mention is that there are still traditions of pastoralism in the state. So gutty shepherds, transhumanant nomadic grazers travel with their herds of goats and sheep seasonally. Some are up in the highland pastures in winter down in the plains and into the Punjab. Gujars travel with their water buffalo up into the mountains in the summer and down into the Punjab area, not in the area around Pathankot in the wintertime. Okay, so the power generation scenario in Himachal is that it has been declared 100% electrified, and that was the point I was making earlier, that these small hydropower projects are not for local consumption. Himachal is 100% electrified. There are some hamlets, some settlements that don't have power. There are some areas in very remote areas that are powered by solar, up in Lahaul Spiti and on the rain shadow side of the mountains. And there are areas with brownouts. But on the whole, Himachal is electrified, and that its electric potential is just over 20,000 megawatts. And a way of thinking about a megawatt is that in the United States, at least, a megawatt per year would power about 1,000 households. And of that potential, approximately 25% has been realized. And the various institutional arrangements for the power that has been produced are indicated in this bottom table. The state sector, the government of Himachal Pradesh, the central government sector is the largest producer of power in the state. Joint sector, significant. Private sector, relatively minor. And then Himerja is the state agency that's responsible for all of the small hydropower as well as other renewable energy projects in the state. And we'll talk more about Himerja as a key feature of the evolution of small-scale hydropower in Himachal. Okay, so I want to talk very briefly about neoliberalism and just mention now a few key points that prior to the 1990s, hydropower development in the state was state-controlled, and that in the 1990s there were parts of that parts of that power sector that were privatized, and that all of the development of the small-scale hydropower projects that we're talking about are being implemented through privatized approaches to power development. So what accounts for this rather dramatic shift from public production of power to entirely private production of small-scale hydropower? And I think that we need to take a little bit of a broader look at the evolution and hegemony of liberalism, and then how that translated into neoliberalism here in India, and then what that means perhaps more generally about rural production systems and the environment. So let's broaden back a little bit and talk about neoliberalism. It's certainly an idea that's been around for a long time. I teach an environmental policy class at Humboldt State, and when we talk about the 1877 Mining Act that declared the public lands of the United States free and open for mineral exploration, it's a classic statement of economic liberalism, where the role of the government is perceived to be to enable the release of creative and individual energy and to embrace a model of government that's laissez-faire and market-oriented. And these ideas of liberalism that we see during the late 19th century in the United States kind of resided in the wings for many, many years until Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher brought them out and embraced them as their ideology and used them to diagnose problems of economic stagnation and inflation in the UK and the United States, and to launch attacks on what they thought of as large governments and overly powerful trade unions. They used the ideology of neoliberalism to roll back government services, to reduce the public provision of goods and services, to eliminate a tax structure that provided social safety nets, to launch attacks against union organizing, all in the name of releasing creative energy. And these ideas that Reagan and Thatcher brought back into the central debate of the role of government in the 1980s coalesced into what was known as the Washington Consensus and drove World Bank and IMF policies, and as we know, underpinned the framework of structural adjustment loans and influenced the conditions under which developing countries could acquire loans and the types of constraints and requirements that they had to abide by in order to get those loans. So that's briefly some of the ideas about neoliberalism that emerged out of the United States and the UK. How did they land in India? And what happened here in India that enabled neoliberalism to get such a foot in the door and to develop the traction that it has? And neoliberalism in India sort of emerged during the 1990s as a result of the balance of payments crisis that was precipitated by the 1991 Gulf War. And in response to that, Manmohan Singh, the then finance minister and Cambridge-educated economist, said we need to approach the IMF for a loan, and that this represented a dramatic about-face from the import substitution approach to the government's involvement in economic development that had characterized the role of the government in India since independence. Prior to that, with the import substitution policy, there had been public sector control over key industrial sectors. We had the Planning Commission. We had the state regulatory control over the private sector in the form of the license permit Raj. And this began to shift dramatically as a result of these changes that occurred in the early 1990s. And so some of those shifts affected India's international relationships, and some of these shifts affected the relations between levels of governance within India. In terms of the international relationships that we can think about within the context of neoliberalism, we had the de-restriction of domestic production. There was no longer a quota system. The industrial licensing was abolished for key industrial sectors. We had a decontrol of foreign trade, allowing imports, and an elimination of tariffs, which had been one of the cornerstones of the import substitution policy. And we had the reform of laws to enable majority shareholding by foreign corporations. These were dramatic shifts in the relationship between India and other countries. Then there were internal changes that matched those external changes. We saw the entry of private enterprise into sectors where previously there had been none: education, healthcare, telecommunications, transport, health, sanitation, and energy. Okay, so this is where some of the energy story comes in. At the same time, there was a decentralization of power and authority from the central government down to state and local level. And individual states had more autonomy and control over decisions about economic growth and development than they had previously. Some states were able to negotiate directly with the World Bank or IMF for loans in a way that would have been unimaginable before 1990. There also was a strengthening of local institutions, the panchayat, through the Panchayati Raj legislation. So there was a process of decentralization that occurred at the same time. Okay, so we've sort of talked about the first 2 points, and we've just been talking about the key dimensions of the neoliberal state and economy in India, and briefly a couple of words about, well, what have been the effects on rural producers and the environment. And there are a variety of scholars of South Asia who are very concerned about what are the negative impacts on rural producers and the environment of the types of shifts that we've been talking about. For example, Gupta and Shiva Ramakrishnan note in their edited volume, The State in India After Liberalization, that the Indian economy after liberalization, this is a quote from their book, is undergoing a process of primitive accumulation that is displacing peasants from the land and artisans from their means of livelihood. Primitive accumulation referring to the separation of the laborer from their means of production. Similarly, in a recent article in the Journal of Peasant Studies, Kathy Lamons Walker argues that India's economic growth is a form of predatory growth. So predatory growth privileges urban India and entails a withdrawal of state subsidies for agriculture and the undermining of peasant production. She says, and here's a quote, that it is an internal colonization of the poor through which the Indian state has expropriated the land and resources of rural dwellers and transformed them to both domestic and international capital. So scholars are raising concerns about what are the local impacts of these types of processes. Now, what's interesting is at the same time we see these reforms, the government of India has embarked on the largest program for social welfare and employment guarantee that has been unrolled ever in the history of India. That is NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And Partha Chatterjee, in an article in the Economic and Political Weekly, says that the reason why NREGA exists is that it is a way of controlling what would otherwise be conflict, unrest, and revolt in the rural agrarian-based areas because of the negative effects that we were just alluding to. And that NREGA, which guarantees 100 days of employment for any family below the poverty line per year, is an opportunity to quell conflict based on the unequal consequences of the neoliberal reforms that we're talking about. So Partha Chatterjee says that in short, NREGA is a way to mitigate the effects of predatory growth. It's a process of the reversal of the effects of primitive accumulation. Let's see, I think. So that's a kind of broad brushstroke overview of neoliberalism and a little bit of the context for what we're talking about in the context of the power sector and electricity reforms. Let's focus in a little bit more and talk about what's been going on within the context of the creation of power and what specifically have neoliberal reforms looked like. And that will set the context for our more micro-level exploration of these small-scale hydropower projects. So briefly, before neoliberalism emerged in 1990 in India, we had a context where there were state-owned utilities, SOUs. There was vertical integration of all components of power generation that was managed by state electricity boards. State electricity boards were created in the Electricity Act of 1948. They controlled the generation, transmission, and distribution of power. They included subsidies for agricultural users. There was a focus on universal access and food security that informed the provision of power. It was not seen as something that was a commodity from which to generate revenue. It was seen as an essential service, and It was also embroiled in electoral politics in terms of the distribution of flat billed or unmetered power to agricultural users as a way to garner and generate electoral support. Let me just... Yeah, so we can just quickly jump to some of the problems that emerged from that pattern of power generation. Over time, there were increasing transmission and distribution losses within the network system. In some systems, transmission and distribution losses averaged between 25 and 35%. In particular states, T&D losses are much higher than that. Actually, earlier this year in J&K, Jammu and Kashmir, transmission losses were up to 65, almost 70%. There were a series of problems associated with the commercial functioning of the state electricity boards. In addition to transmission and distribution losses, the cost of supply increased dramatically. The revenue that was generated through the sale of electricity was inadequate to cover the costs, in part because of this legacy of subsidization of power for agricultural users. Beginning in as of the early 1990s and mid-1990s, the revenue losses of state electricity boards comprised over 25% of states' fiscal deficits. And so there were increasing problems with revenue generation that resulted in a declining infrastructure because of inadequate capital to invest in the maintenance and repair of the transmission and distribution system. So there was a series of responses. Industry tended to have to pay a lot higher rates for electricity in contrast to agricultural users that were flat billed. Industry did not appreciate that. They tried to generate their own power through captive generation. And the central government stepped in and tried to add to the power generation capacity of individual states. And these were the sort of triggers. These were the problems associated with the public system of power generation that made it ripe for a variety of reforms beginning in the 1990s related to neoliberalism. So what were those key reforms? And there's just briefly three components, three stages that I want to touch on. The first being the amendment of the Electricity Act from 1948 and also the Independent Power Producer Law of 1992. And briefly, these two pieces of legislation allowed private power investors to invest in the construction and management of power generation facilities. This is what enabled Enron to come to India and begin the process that eventually led in the collapse and bankruptcy of Enron, but it was enabled by the Independent Power Producer Law here. It guaranteed a rate of return, and it liberalized foreign equity participation in power generation. Secondly, the distribution privatization and independent regulation. That was an unbundling of the vertical monopoly that I was talking about earlier, where there was a separation of the generation and distribution and transmission of electricity, and it enabled private sector investment in different components of that process. So, for example, Orissa privatized the distribution system of the power network in Orissa. That was enabled through the distribution privatization. And then independent regulation was an effort to remove the electoral politics behind the provision of electricity by having an independent regulatory body, the State Electrical Regulatory Commission, established for all states in India. And the purpose of that State Electrical Regulatory Commission was to establish tariffs and rates for power provision, and also to create a forum for various constituencies and interest groups to bring and air their concerns. And then lastly, the 2003 electricity bill. And that bill was an overarching framework to guide these reforms. It got to the core issue of the distribution of power, and also addressed the subsidy and metering issues that we were talking about earlier. Okay, so I need to move through quickly here. Until what time do I have?
5 past.
5 past. So let's move through and take a look at, having established this broad context, the 2006 hydropower policy in Himachal Pradesh. So we've reviewed the various steps that have led up to this. Let's take a look at the focus now on privatized power production in the state of Himachal Pradesh. This is what the policy says about small-scale hydropower. It's going to be cheap, renewable, reliable. It will improve the quality of power in rural and tribal areas, be a source of decentralized power supply. It should check environmental degradation, provide youth employment opportunities, and provide conditions conducive for private investors. These are the guidelines of the small hydropower policy. Projects up to 2 megawatts are reserved for bona fide Himachalis, and there's a series of application and planning steps that the power policy outlines. So Himerja was created in the late 1990s to guide the focus on renewable power production, and it is the nodal agency for all small-scale power projects. It has identified approximately 500 sites in Himachal that are supposedly suitable for small-scale hydropower. Independent power producers respond to offers of allotment from Himerja, and they generate an MOU for developing a particular project site. The independent power producer then has to prepare a detailed survey investigation report, a detailed project report, and then upon approval of that detailed project report, Himerja provides this techno-economic clearance, an IA implementation agreement. Then the power producer obtains no objection certificates from the Forest Department, the Wildlife Department, the Irrigation and Public Health Department, the local panchayat, the Public Works Department, and I'm probably forgetting one or two others, but a whole slew of NOCs. After those are obtained, construction commences. These are some of the guidelines to control and guide the development of power. 15% of the stream flow is to be maintained. Workers are to be registered by the power producer at the local police station and labor office. Most of the employment should go to local Himachalis. Each IPP is to contribute 1% of the construction cost to a local area development authority committee, and I'll talk more about that later. The guaranteed purchase price for the power is rupees 250 per kilowatt hour, and that turns out to be approximately $200,000 per year per megawatt that the IPP receives, and these projects are between 2 and 5 megawatts in size. Royalties are provided to the government of Himachal Pradesh at an increasing rate over the period of the project, and then the project returns to the government after 40 years. Okay, and that there are significant subsidies from the Ministry of Non-Conventional Energy Sources of up to 2.25 crores per megawatt. The construction cost of a lot of these projects are between 6 and 8 crores per megawatt. Okay, so we've taken a look at what are these small-scale projects. We've taken a look at the relationship between privatized power and the neoliberal regime of governance. Now let's look at the actual local impacts of these projects. I'm going to skip my research methodology in the interest of time, but I'm more than happy to talk about how I conducted this research between January and June. I had a couple of wonderful and able research assistants, Kesar Singh on the left, Parveen Bardwaj on the right. My 13-year-old son, Anson, also joined us for about 5 weeks of the research. We surveyed all 51 of the commissioned power projects in the state of Himachal Pradesh. There's 51 that are commissioned. There's another 50 that are under construction. There's another 400 in the pipeline. This is the map of the total number of planned power projects. You'll see that it represents the potential to completely, dramatically transform the landscape of the western Himalayan region of HP. The commission projects alone are significant. As I go through the results, I'm going to talk mostly about Kangra, Chamba, and District Kulu because there are significant patterns of outcome in those 3 districts. This is information about methodology. So, Local Area Development Authority. These are this is a review of the findings that I want to share with you now. We'll talk a bit about what's been happening with the Local Area Development Authority. There's two components to the effects of small hydropower projects to be explored in District Congra, the effects on cool irrigation and on labor relations. In Chumba, we're going to look at the effects on grots, which are water-powered mills, and environmental impacts. In Kulu, we'll look at transmission lines, fisheries, and the NOC process. And then we'll look at two exceptions to neoliberalism, two institutional exceptions. Local Area Development Authority is supposed to be a committee that the sub-district magistrate chairs, that the IPP sits on, that the village panchayat pradhan sits on, and this committee receives 1% of the construction costs of a small hydropower project. We're talking anywhere from 28 to 65 lakhs. And this committee is supposed to receive, the money is deposited in the office of the divisional commissioner. The committee meets and develops a shelf of projects that it would like to see implemented in the context of the region affected by the power project. And then that project shelf list is sent to the district commissioner. Projects are requested, and then those projects should be implemented using funds from the LADA committee. Some examples of projects that have been implemented underneath this program include things like a veterinary dispensary, Ayurvedic dispensary, cremation ground, meeting hall, furniture, pool repair, culverts and road repair, footbridges, playground. There are some serious problems with this program. There's poor record keeping. Only one district in the state keeps central records of what is being done with the funds and what projects are being implemented. There's a problem with IPPs not paying. For example, in Chumba District, there are 246 lakhs owed for the LADA accounts, but only 69 lakhs have been paid in. There are problems with defining the project-affected area, the definitional issues in terms of who's actually benefiting and where those projects are located. There's inadequate publicity and outreach. We spoke with some pradhans who had never heard of the LADA effort. There's a concern there about the lack of knowledge about this program. There's also concerns with the choice of projects and some committees not being able to get the DC to approve the projects that they'd like to see approved. There are a couple of shining examples of success stories. Here are, that is a meeting hall, that's a playground, and this is a veterinary dispensary that was all created with LADA funds. Let's go on to a quick review of the effects on irrigation. So this is Congra Valley, 40,000 hectares irrigated with thousands of farmer-managed irrigation systems. Extraordinary examples of collective action where rural community members have come together to convey water to irrigate their agricultural fields. And there are there's language within the no objection certificate that says cool irrigation should be protected. Here's an example of the no objection certificate between the IPP and the Irrigation and Public Health Department, and it states that if any private cool is disturbed, the project authority has to talk with the Gram Panchayat to come up with a plan for addressing that disturbance. Well, in our research, we've seen that there are 9 cools that have been destroyed by the small hydropower project. And here's a example of 3. You'll see the powerhouse over there in the far right. These fields should be thick with winter wheat, but because the water is being diverted for the power project in a manner that restricts the flow of water for this cool irrigation system, this cool has no water, and these 35 households have had to abandon cultivation of either wheat or alsi, linseed, which is another winter crop in this area. Here's another example of an area where, because of the diversion of water, there was no water for irrigation. Farmers attempted to put in pumps, use pipes to conduct that water to irrigate, in this case, some vegetable crops for sale, and were unsuccessful and had to leave that land barren. So there were 9 cools that were destroyed, and here we see an example of a power project that has been stopped short, and I'm not sure if I'm getting my pointer here, but we can just go down another picture here and see that this power project has been stopped short by this thin ribbon of water, and that's a cool channel. And farmers are now getting smart, and they're saying, we're not going to allow you to continue this power project. In fact, if you destroy this cool, we'll destroy your project. And at this point, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the farmers. This cool travels 22 kilometers and irrigates land in more than 10 villages. Thousands of families depend on this water for subsistence agriculture. This is a contrast between privatized power in the pipes or water through the cool channel for multiple villages. They are now holding this project hostage until the project authorities agree to their conditions, which have to do with promises about maintaining the flow of water. So I'm going to run into time constraint problems here, so we'll just go as quickly as we can. There are also significant concerns about labor relations. There are requirements that workers are registered with the police station and the local labor office. And the reason why it's important for workers to be registered, also using Form B for regular registration, is that when they're registered, they're covered under workers' compensation. They can receive contributions for their pension plan. And in the event of death, compensation is provided to family members. And in the research that we did, we found that many areas, many projects, do not abide by these requirements, and that, let's see here, I want to make sure I get the right numbers. Of the 51 commissioned small hydropower projects, only 17 employ workers that are registered as regular employees. 2/3 of the power projects employ workers as temporary or daily wage workers, and as a result, they are not covered by any of the labor laws that should be protecting them. And secondly, there are significant numbers of people who have died in the construction of these small-scale hydropower projects. 47 people died in the construction of these 51 hydropower projects. Of those 47, 21 were Himachali and 26 were non-Himachali migrant workers who had come in from Bihar, J&K, and Nepal. None of those non-Himachali workers were registered, and there was no compensation paid for the people of this disposable workforce when they died in the construction of these projects. There are union activities and efforts to hold IPPs accountable. They hide behind the excuse of these are not our employees, they are those of our contractors, and that's a common ploy that we see also here in the United States. And the Labor Court has written a series of opinions about the responsibility and obligations of IPPs for workers, whether or not they are workers of the IPP or of the contractor. And the Labor Court is also working on issues having to do with workers who are working as permanent employees but actually hired on a temporary and daily wage basis. Okay, so let's take a look at Chumba. And there are some issues in Chumba that we need to review. Here's Chumba Town. The coppers in the museum in Chumba Town date back to the 10th century. It's been here for a very long time. I want to talk about grots. So grots are these water-powered mills that are used to grind flour, and you'll see water coming through. It's driven by there's not a picture of it here, but there is an axle with a horizontal paddle wheel, and then the top end of that axle is a grinding stone, and above that is another one that spins around. You go inside that building, and here is a woman who is working the grot to mill flour. And a lot of grots are run and managed by single women. It's an important source of employment for single women-headed households. The water coming out of the grot flows on down, is used for a variety of purposes. And in our research, we're looking at the effects of these small-scale hydropower projects in grots. 104 have been rendered defunct as a result of the construction and operation of these 51 projects. And they are destroyed when rocks are displaced through the construction of the project, or when water is diverted so that there's no water for the grot itself and there's no water to turn the wheel to grind the grain. There's an example of interesting resistance to this. This is a valley behind Chumba with probably 18 grots. All these little houses that you see here are grots. And this is another shot that shows you more grots. They're sprinkled generously throughout the landscape. These grots power and are continuing to work, in this case also running a sawmill and a thresher and a couple other machines. And they're holding this project hostage and saying, we're not going to let water flow into this project until you guarantee compensation for our grots. And there was finally a meeting with the divisional commissioner and the SDM and the IPP and the grot maliks of this area, where the grot maliks demanded, well, we need a daily wage for each grot for the duration of this project, which is 40 years. And if you pay each grot malik 16 lakh, then we'll allow this project to go through. And so that was the agreement that was eventually arranged in this area to address that. Again, there was no support from the state. It was only a result of collective action on the part of these grot maliks. Let's quickly turn to another aspect of Chumba, which is that it is steep. It is a very different landscape than that plain irrigated alluvial delta shot I showed you of Congra. It's an area that is also landslide prone. Now let's see if we can get this. So here, wherever there's a cut made in the hill, and it's not coming through, but you can see a landslide begins and the head swale starts creeping up that steep slope. And you can take a look here in streams. This is a huge slug of sediment that emerged from a slope failure upstream. And you can see here the sediment clogging the streams down below. This is an environmentally fragile and landslide-prone area. And that has affected the small hydropower projects in this area. And here is a pipe that was destroyed by a landslide. And if we continue on with a shot, that's the power channel slipping down the slope. And we can go back a little bit, and there's that power channel in the upper right. And you can see the landslide moving up, and that's where it comes down. The road here has also created a series of landslides. And if you look at the next photo, what do you see way up there on that hill but residences, a village, a settlement. And that slide's just going to continue working its way up. Let's take a quick look at the DPR. And the DPR is the detailed project report that I talked to you about earlier, and see in Chapter 6 what the DPR for this particular small hydropower project says. Chapter 6 is geological and geotechnical studies, and after pages and pages of geological analysis, we see that there is no major geological problem around the project area. There is no landslide zone. So this points up to a problem about the detailed project reports and the oversight that Hermerja is applying with respect to the analysis of these projects. Okay, I'm going to rush through here and take a look now in Kulu. There are serious concerns in Kulu. Kulu is an area famous for its apples. It's also famous for tourism and newlyweds to go to Manali. And it's also a place of central religious pilgrimage. There are concerns here about, okay, here's some of the tourism slides, ski slopes, paragliding, downhill skiing. Kulu Valley is crucial. The economy of Kulu Valley in terms of tourism and economic activity related to it relies on the aesthetics of the valley. There are concerns with transmission lines moving through the valley and disrupting that. But what I want to talk briefly about is fisheries. And I told you earlier about the desilting tanks. Well, when those desilting tanks are cleaned, how are they cleaned? They're cleaned by flushing that sediment out the river and out of the tank and into the river. And this is a small-scale hydropower project. And when the bigger hydropower project upstream is going to clean their desilting tank, they'd tell Aleo Power Project here, shut off your weir site because there's going to be a slug of sediment coming down that stream. What they don't do is and so that's going to save the mud from going through the Pelton wheel and save the infrastructure. What they don't tell is the local IPH department. So here's the drinking water supply for both new homes and traditional homes. You can see here the difference in construction between those who engage in the tourist economy and the old traditional beautiful Kulu style. And mud flows out of the drinking water systems because of the cleaning of those desilting tanks. That is a concern for fisheries. Remember earlier I mentioned that 15% of the water from a stream is supposed to be left in the stream. What do you see 15% flowing past this weir? Is there 15% flowing behind that weir? Is there any monitoring of that 15% flow restriction? Almost none. So as the Department of the Fisheries Department for Himachal told me, fish cannot migrate past weir sites. There's another issue with these weir sites is that they leapfrog hopscotch downstreams. So that over there is the hydropower project that was held hostage by the Gurat Maliks. And right here is the intake for the next downstream small hydropower project. And the ones that I was showing you in Chumba, there's 4 of them in that landslide-prone watershed, one after the other. So that the water has hardly any time to stay in the stream. Diverted, returned, diverted, returned. So that's also a problem. That's a problem for the Fisheries Department and their fish hatchery in Putli Khul in Kulu Valley. And this fisheries hatchery is extraordinary. It produces fish, and it was established with Norwegian support in 1999. And here's the tons of fish that it's producing across the scale here. Trout ova. We actually enjoyed fish that dinner ourselves. That evening ourselves. They also produce fish feed. And they're concerned about this slug of sediment because their water relies on intake from this stream here, above which there are small-scale hydropower projects. And there are other reasons to be concerned about these small fingerlings in this area. And that's because there are a very large number of livelihoods that depend on the fish. And that there's a whole fish story to the small-scale hydropower project that needs to be explored. And fish farming. So 8 years ago, there were 4 fish farmers in Kulu. There's now 52 to 55 fish farmers. Last year, they produced 50 tons of trout for sale in Kulu and also transport down to Chandigarh, Delhi, Mumbai. And they earned 3 lakh per household for the fish that they raised and sold. And the trout fishery and the Department of Fisheries sees tremendous opportunity for expanding the number of people who are fishing. And this ova production here, fish ova production statistics relates to their ability to supply the fish fingerlings as well as the feed for these trout farmers. There are also 350 cast net license holders in Kulu, 2,000 in Kangra and 200 in Chumba. The Fisheries Department estimates that 10,000 households depend entirely or significantly on fisheries. There's also an active sport fishing tradition in Kulu District with 750 sport fishing licenses. The economic revenue potential of sport fishing has only been realized in this country through economic studies of regions where there's a lot of sport fishing. No such studies have happened yet in HP, but these sport fishermen are coming into the area for sport fishing purposes and spending a lot of money. These are all ways of contributing livelihood sustenance through fisheries that are threatened by the small-scale hydropower projects we've been talking about. There's one river that's been declared off-limits to small hydropower development. That's the Tirthan River. This is the Honorable Dilli Ram Shabab, former member of the Legislative Assembly in Shimla and long-term resident of Gusheni, a village on the banks of the Tirthan River. For 5 years, he mobilized government officials and the local community to fend off the construction of 6 proposed small hydropower projects in the Tirthan River. Finally, was successful with a HP High Court decision that said that these projects were not going to be allowed. And that was partly a function of the high quality of the Tirthan River. There was a whole series of benefits that were described. And also in the court case, a series of disadvantages, such as we've been discussing from small hydro, that bolstered the decision to prohibit these small-scale hydropower projects, and the fact that it was part of and proximate to the Great Himalayan National Park. This is the Tirthan River. Let's see here. I got to get my bearings. This is the Tirthan River here. The headwaters in that GHNP flows down to Largi, where it joins the Sange River, which also comes out of the northern part of the GHNP. The Largi has not been receiving such protection. There's also the Trout Conservation Angling Association that are interested in supporting fisheries. These are just a few shots of the stocking of the Tirthan River by the Fisheries Department. I'm rushing now because we're so short on time. and Richard's going to blow the whistle on me. This is the confluence of the Tirthan and the Senge. I don't know if it comes through in this shot now, but that's beautiful, clear trout water. This is sediment-laden Senge River water. This is before the monsoon hits. This is in April. This disruption has nothing to do with rains. It has everything to do with sediment loading from small hydro and large hydro. Okay, I'm going to make, can I have 3 minutes? 2 minutes. There's big problems with those no objection certificates. The going price for a no objection certificate from a Panchayat Pradhan is 10 to 15 lakh. The IPP needs to spend 50 lakhs per megawatt to get all the NOCs they need from all the government departments. So that's 250 lakhs required for a 5 megawatt project to pull the NOCs out of the government agencies. There's tremendous rent-seeking behavior on the part of government agencies, and there's very little accountability that the NOCs actually provide. Okay, so let's take a look. Track record of these 51 HSPs. LADA is not very good. 9 defunct pools, 104 destroyed ghats, 47 deaths, insecure employment in 2/3 of the projects, landslides and debris slides in some areas, negative impact on fisheries, NOC not working, overall lack of accountability. It does not look good. And is this the inevitable outcome of the primitive accumulation, predatory growth that we've been talking about earlier? Are there any alternatives? I want to offer two. The first is location. If these projects are sited out of settled and intensively cultivated areas, their local negative impacts are much less. Okay, there's penstock running past that forested, uninhabited ridge. Here's more penstock. Here's 3 powerhouses, one inside a cliff, 2 others in a steep forested area. Contrast that with the earlier images in densely inhabited areas. Location, location, location. 2 other sources of hope having to do with exceptions to neoliberalism. This on the outside of it looks like a regular, actually kind of like a fancy house. It's actually a powerhouse. And there's the pipe and the penstock, and you saw that photo earlier, and you get the normal Pelton wheel and turbines on the inside, and you go up to the top level, and what do you see? Puja room, Sai Baba, Sai Engineering Foundation, social welfare organization whose newsletter Karma Yoga talks about its principles in terms of applying the ideas of Sai Baba and social service and service to society and the environment, using engineering to generate revenue, which is then invested in a series of philanthropic activities, health, environment, economic empowerment, goes on and on, relief operations, education, blood camps, eye camps, scholarships for poor children. This is an interesting exception to neoliberalism in terms of a non-corporate modality for producing power. One last exception to neoliberalism that I want to share with you in terms of the institutional structure and governance possibilities for small-scale hydropower is cooperative societies. We found one out of the 51 power projects, one cooperative society that offers another alternative approach to generating power. This is the Trehan Floriculture Cooperative Society. They got 85 households, all BPL, working on greenhouses and producing carnations in greenhouses for sale in Chandigarh. And what's interesting about the Trehan Cooperative Floriculture Society is they're working on getting the NOCs and the permits for 2 small-scale hydropower projects. They have 400 families signed up, all that are below poverty line. They're all putting up their little patch of land and their home as collateral to get the financing approved. And the profits from those 2 small-scale hydropower projects will be going to all 400 families. And this is O.P. Sharma, an extraordinary individual who's the executive director of the Trehan Cooperative Floriculture Society. And I'm going to read my last paragraph and then turn it over to Richard before he shoots me. So, the future trajectory of small hydropower development in HP remains to be seen. If the next 450 small hydropower projects generate a track record similar to the first 50, then regional society and the environment will be much the poorer for it. However, if civil society mobilizations and resistance are sustained, then those motivated by the spoils of quick profits and generous subsidies may think twice about developing small hydropower projects. I think that the possibilities offered by Sci Engineering Foundation, cooperative societies, if those are embraced, and if the independent power producers back off in the face of resistance, then the rent-seeking behavior on the part of government agencies may be reduced. And there is a possibility that the future of small hydropower generation may not be a repetition of this first generation. Thanks very much.
Here's the presentation, so with no more embellishment, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Tucker, for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to also thank Center for South Asian Studies and Trehan Foundation for making this workshop possible. I think this is a great workshop. We can learn a lot about the environment in India, and we had two excellent presentations before by Mark and Shubhra talking about how the landscape, changes in landscape can affect people's lives. Some of those changes can be dramatic. You can see those effects immediately when the landscape or urbanization can take place because of course, currently with a lot of economic development in India. My talk is going to be focused on environmental toxic chemicals. As you know, as we develop our industries, which is a part of development or economic growth, a lot of toxic chemicals are released, and people are exposed to these toxic chemicals. Sometimes you won't see the effect immediately because we are exposed to these chemicals at very slow doses, even without us knowing. When we are having our lunch, dinner, when you drink water, you are exposed to many different types of chemicals. The chemicals can come from the plastic bottles that are used for your drinking water, or from the cups that you are using to take your Coke. They are all coated with some materials inside, and you are exposed to those chemicals. And you may be exposed to many tiny amount, very tiny amount like nanogram or picogram levels. So some of these chemicals may not kill you immediately. So people are not sometimes worried about it, but they kill you slowly. They affect the quality of our life with time because we are constantly exposed to these chemicals every day. And so some of the changes that we see from exposure to these chemicals can be very long, unlike Mark and Shubhra's talk, where the landscape changes can affect the society immediately. Within no time you will see the changes. But with the chemical exposure, it can be a long-term effect. And they can affect the quality of life as well. I am an environmental chemist or environmental toxicologist. My interests are in understanding environmental exposure to many toxic chemicals and how these chemicals lead to humans, the pathways through which humans get exposed to these chemicals, and what are the ultimate effects of these chemicals. Because I am with the School of Public Health, so we also conduct a lot of epidemiological studies. So people with certain regions, you may find people having a lot of diseases. For instance, here in Michigan, I have done some studies in the Tittabawassee River and Saginaw River. The dioxin levels are very high in those rivers, and the breast cancer rate is much higher in the watershed of the Tittabawassee River and Saginaw River in comparison with other parts of the state. So the chemical pollution can have implications on public health or human health. Unfortunately, these kinds of studies are not well done in India because they're very expensive. If somebody brings me a water sample and asks me to analyze dioxins, it takes a lot of time and very sophisticated instrumentation. So we need to use instruments, for instance, high-resolution mass spec, which is $500,000. And these kinds of facilities are not still developed in India. So my studies are not like Shubhra or Mark's studies. They are case studies, very well done, very systematic studies. My talk is going to be very sporadic in nature because I found some of the opportunities, because I want to develop some database for India to see what the levels of those chemicals are. There are no such studies done in India, but whenever there is an opportunity, these are not really funded. So, but when we have some time out of interest, we collect samples from India, environmental samples, wildlife samples, dolphins, whales, fish, humans, and then look for the presence of those chemicals in those specimens and see if the levels are above certain limit, because the international organizations like FAO, WHO have some threshold values. And we check if the levels have exceeded those limits, at least to have some information available for the, either Indian government to act or at least to raise the public awareness. Because we don't have public awareness for these kinds of issues in India. Unless we have some data, it is very difficult to create or raise awareness. So just I wanted to start with a little background. I know many of you know more about India than me. I left India 23 years ago. But for those who are not familiar, I just wanted to start with a little geography and demography. It is the 7th largest country in the world, and the size of the land is about 1/3 of the US area. Population is 1.2 billion, and 2/3 of the population is less than 35 years. So we have a lot of young people, which is a big resource for the country. And it's the largest democracy. Per capita income is $3,700, and it's increasing, as you might know. And there are 14 official languages, but several hundred dialects. If you ask people, nobody knows how many languages are spoken in India, but there are at least 14 official languages. And the urban population is only 30% of the total population, which means most of the people, 70% of the people, are in rural areas. That has some implications for the environmental pollution as well. Literacy rate is currently at 74%. One thing, when I talk about India, I wanted to remind people that this concept of unity in diversity. Because why I wanted to talk about this is when, for instance, I did my PhD in Japan, as Dr. Tucker mentioned. It's a very homogeneous society, so you can generalize things for society with homogeneous population. But with India, it's a very heterogeneous population. So many languages, cultures, and so many different things. So it's very difficult to generalize things. So when I talk about pollution, it may be applicable to certain areas. It may not be applicable for the entire country. That's what I wanted to say here, because it's a very diverse country. For instance, it is the 10th largest economy in the world as of now, but on the other side, it is 129th in GDP ranking. So it's a rich country, but it's a poor country because it is 129th in the ranking of GDP because of the huge population. But it's the 10th largest economy, and 3rd in purchasing power, and most of the economy is from the service sector. Almost 2/3 is from the service sector, which means industry is not really as developed as in many countries like Korea or Japan or in the United States. That has some positive aspect towards pollution, because most of the pollution is because of the industrialization. And India is still not an industrial country. So if you compare India with China, China is very highly polluted. The rivers are choking with all these toxic chemicals dumped. The population downstream is drinking, river water contaminated with the benzene, and lots of health problems. Because I also have an appointment in China, so I go there often to do this pollution-related aspects. More like teaching and collaborating on many different studies, because it's a very good environment when we have such a pollution problem and people are exposed to those toxic chemicals. It's a very good case to prove that how these pollutants are affecting the health of the people. So that's why we have a lot of collaborations going on in China. Luckily in India, it's not industrially developed, so the industrial pollution is not that high. And it's 10th in the world with most millionaires. 1.7% of the population is millionaires. On the other hand, population below poverty line is 30%. They earn $1.25 per day. So you have two extremes here again. A lot of millionaires and people below the poverty line earning $1, about $1 per day. That's a problem. And mobile phone usage, number 2 in the world, and 1/3 of the population of India is middle class, which is almost the same as the size of U.S. population, about 400 million. 46% of the Indian children are malnourished, and infant mortality is still very high. So it's all on the dark side of India. If you look at the other side, the food waste from wedding parties can feed millions of people. This is an article came out very recently, the last point here, 2-3 weeks ago. There was a study conducted by Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, very reliable study. They just, there are about several hundred wedding halls in Bangalore. They surveyed for a year, and then they have indicated that waste from Bangalore alone can feed 2.6 million people every year. Just one city producing this much of waste, after wedding parties. And that is, they've also estimated the cost in terms of dollars. It is $68 million per year. So again, people are malnourished, no food. On the other hand, food wastage. So again, it's all extremes. Sometimes, when you think of India, when I was in Japan, they think it's a very hot country. That's what people say, generalize things. And sometimes they say it's very poor, and there are certain things that we cannot generalize. It has to be qualified: where, when, how, and what does it mean? Those kinds of things. And same thing applies for my talk about pollution, because I have taken samples sporadically here and there because of these are all opportunity studies, not case studies. Wonderful case studies like Mark and Shubhra did. I really like those studies. Because those studies, studies that we do are not specifically funded either by the Indian government or other governments. Because out of interest, we have students, they wanted to do something and something new, interesting, nobody has done that before, to see what's really happening. That's how we collected samples and did these studies. So when you talk about environmental issues, there are many issues. Shubhra and Dr. Mark talked about it. Some of the things that we are concerned about are rampant burning of fuel wood and biomass, lack of organized garbage and waste removal services. So you can see garbage is scattered everywhere. No sewage treatment operations, so the wastewater is directly discharged into many rivers. No water drainage system or flood control, no stormwater drainage. And also diversion of consumer waste into rivers directly without any treatment, cremation practices because of special religious beliefs that cause a lot of river pollution, chemical pollution, and also indiscriminate use of chemicals. Some of the laws are very lax, so no rigorous laws on some of the chemical usage. And of course, land erosion and soil erosion and land degradation. These are some of the environmental issues that are common. People know, but this is a satellite picture showing smoke in the northeastern part of India. And this smoke basically coming from many of the incineration activities in India and also some of the neighboring countries. And this topic has been in some of the journals, very well publicized study of air pollution, air quality in India. Even the satellite pictures showing some of this smoke and smog-like things in northeastern India. So, because I am from the public health school, my interest is how this environmental chemical pollution can be related to diseases. And we have in the United States, there are a lot of such studies going on. NIH has been funding many studies. We are involved in, I have 20 different projects on chemical exposure and health outcomes in people. CDC has been monitoring people's exposure to chemicals, American people. Every year, they collect samples from the population in America. They look for chemicals in people's blood and urine. And we can measure at least 300 different types of toxic chemicals in everybody's blood. And everyone has that many number of toxic chemicals. Whether you know or not, it is there. We are exposed from many different types of sources. So the economic growth has raised the issue of environmental sustainability. So economic growth means a lot of modernization, use of different types of products and chemicals that people have never used in the past. Obviously, those products release many chemicals into the environment, and people get exposed to those chemicals. And if you look at the statistics, the infectious diseases have declined in India. Obviously, diseases like malaria or other communicable diseases. Whereas the non-communicable diseases, now we call it as environmental diseases, diseases caused by environmental factors like diabetes. You can have an increase in the risk of diabetes from exposure to some toxic chemicals like bisphenol A, which is used in many plastic products, or in canned food material. The canned food, the can inside of the can is coated with this compound so that the can will not rust. But that product, that chemical, when you eat canned food, you are exposed to that chemical. And that chemical has been shown to cause many different health problems. Diabetes is one of the problems that chemical can cause. And everyone in the world, especially the Americans, have very high levels of bisphenol A in the blood. So the environmental diseases in India are on the rise. For instance, diabetes. India is called the diabetes capital of the world. Lot of diabetes. People, with this. Of course, nutrition can be a factor, but the environment augments this problem, especially some of the triggers. The environmental chemicals are like triggers, the switch. You may have a electric current, but if the switch is not turned on, you won't see the light. Same way, people talk about nutrition or genetics are the causes for diseases, but the environmental trigger is very important to make the disease happen. So the diabetes is on the rise. Cardiovascular diseases. 60% of the world's heart patients are in India. So a lot of people with heart problems. Congenital hypothyroidism. Babies, when they are born, their thyroid levels are very low. As you know, thyroid hormone is very important for the brain development, metabolic, it plays a major role in metabolism. And any reduction in thyroid hormone levels during the early life stages can affect the brain development, the metabolism. That's why that can also lead to obesity and, things like that. So 1 in every 2,640 people in India have hypothyroidism, congenital hypothyroidism, the babies. It's something to do with the babies, not the adults. Asthma is on the rise. For instance, Bangalore, it's the 4th largest city in India. 25% of the children have asthma. There are some statistics, prior to this study, they say that it is 50%, but, after all the corrections, it is now 25%. And in Delhi, it is 10% of the children have asthma. And endometriosis, it's again uterus problem in women. And this disease is related to chemical exposure, especially chemicals that are similar to estrogen. Bisphenol A, phthalates, many materials that are present in plastics, they act like estrogen in the body. So when we are exposed to those chemicals, the body thinks that it's exposed to estrogen, and it changes all the endocrine levels in the body, and that can cause endometriosis. In fact, we have completed a large study in the United States involving 2,000 people and showed that some chemicals are directly associated with endometriosis, the chemicals that affect estrogen metabolism in the body. And in fact, I was in India this summer in July. I was visiting, I was basically sampling. We have a funding now provided by the Japanese government to look at pharmaceuticals and antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the Indian environment. So I have some Japanese colleagues. I still have my connection with the Japanese friends, my former lab. So we wrote this proposal together to get the funding from Japanese government. We got a big funding. So we went to India to collect samples from the Ganges River, many water bodies because these waters receive the wastewaters without any treatment. Obviously, you can expect a lot of pharmaceuticals, because when you take pharmaceuticals or any drug, most of them goes into the waste, and then it reaches rivers, and obviously the microorganisms develop resistance because they are constantly exposed to these antibiotics, and then that can become a very serious threat in future. And there are some interesting studies in India showing that some of the really alarming results about the presence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the Indian environment. So this study has been funded, and we went there to collect samples, and we met with many medical doctors, and most of them were talking about all these issues, especially the endometriosis. It's on the rise in women. So all these have some implications with regard to the cost, because if the quality of your life is affected, it's a cost it's a burden for the government, because government is paying for all these health costs. And the health cost from air and water, some of the information I actually took that from Center for Science and Environment. They are NGOs who are really doing interesting and good studies. Some very good scientists are also working for this NGO, non-governmental organization in New Delhi. So about $7 billion was the cost estimated from air and water pollution in 1999. And premature deaths due to air pollution, 52,000 per year. As I told you before, although India is developing, we still have premature births, and infant mortality still very high. And 10% of the children in Delhi have asthma, and India spends about $1 billion annually to make up for the health damages caused by air pollution. It's a lot of money. But unfortunately, the politicians do not think that what they should do to reduce this burden. Countries like the US, Western European countries, they pay attention to these kinds of problems. Healthy population is very important for the prosperity of the country, for the the working power and things like that. So we are basically, the government is indirectly, it costs a lot of money for the government because of these pollution-related problems. Despite this, there are no comprehensive epidemiological studies to show the effects of environmental chemicals on human health in India, because there were no schools of public health, at least until 4 or 5 years ago. Then I've been contacted by some American associations for the School of Public Health, helping India to develop the schools of public health throughout the country. So I think Delhi University started its first School of Public Health just a couple of years ago. They are developing curriculum, so they have been getting some help from the scientists from the US, what type of curriculum and research should be done in the schools of public health. I think that should be an important step forward, and I think they are going in the right direction. With all these issues with health and the environment, again, typical of any government in any country, the blame game. The health ministry blames environment ministry for creating the problem, and the environment ministry blames health ministry for not taking any action. So who is responsible in the end? Nobody knows. Nobody basically cares, and the sufferers are the people. I would like to talk a little bit about air pollution, water pollution, and then the solid waste pollution. These are some of the published studies. So as you can see here, India uses some of the petrol, diesel, which are of low quality, a lot of sulfur in the diesel. So obviously the air pollution is very severe. And the Central Pollution Control Board, something similar to EPA here, is responsible for monitoring air quality in India. And they have set up many monitoring stations throughout the country. There are supposed to be 300 monitoring stations, rural, urban, in all different areas. And sometimes you cannot get the information from them when you want the information, unfortunately. And there are some studies reporting that the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, benzene, these are carcinogenic chemicals. Exposure to these compounds can cause blood cancer, leukemia. Ozone levels, volatile organic carbon, carbon monoxide, suspended particulate levels are all above the WHO guidelines in the urban air in India, like in Delhi, Agra, those kinds of places. So we have data, and clearly the levels are above the WHO guidelines for those things. This is again another study published in a very popular journal here. I think it's Nature or JAMA or something like that, showing the PM 2.5, the particulate matter, the respirable. You can't see those particles in the naked eye, but we are exposed to this particulate matter every day. And the levels in India, especially the northern India, is above the WHO limit of 10 microgram per cubic meter. The red zone here is about 25 to 50 or 100 microgram per cubic meter. So you can see that some of the locations, and also you can see the very dark zone here in China. So the particulate matter levels are very high. People are breathing, this air every day. Obviously, you can expect a lot of health problems from the air pollution. In 2007, yes.
Why is the Sahara so?
Again, the dust storm. When you have a storm, the resuspension of the particles can, result in PM 2.5 in the air. It need not necessarily be from the vehicular pollution. It can be from the dust resuspension also. If the land is not covered, the soil erosion-related problems. If you have a wind, then you basically resuspend those particles and create the PM 2.5 in the air. So in 2007, about 80% of 127 air monitoring stations monitored, at least one criteria pollutant exceeded the annual average ambient air quality standards in India. So these information are all available. So this is again, there are some data from Agra where Taj Mahal is located. So the PM10 about in urban area it is 154 microgram per cubic meter. In rural area 148 microgram per cubic meter. PM 2.5 again around 100 microgram per cubic meter. And these values are about 10 to 100 times higher than the WHO limit. Hyderabad is another urban area, 30 to 300 microgram per cubic meter. As I told you, the WHO limit is 10 microgram per cubic meter. And we have here 30 to 300 microgram per cubic meter. So the air quality is not good. The PAH is the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They are carcinogenic, and the levels in Agra is again 120 nanogram per cubic meter. And in Delhi it is 850 nanogram per cubic meter. And the WHO guideline is 1 nanogram per cubic meter. So 100 to 1,000 times higher than the guideline value recommended by the World Health Organization. So this is another slide showing, again, this is a published paper from published in Environmental Health Perspectives, the world's most polluted cities. And Delhi is number 1. The red bar is for the pollution level, that is the particulate matter, PM level in 2002, microgram per cubic meter. So Delhi is number 1, Calcutta is number 3. The blue bar is the population in millions. Obviously, Tokyo has the highest population, almost 35 million, the Tokyo metropolitan and the surrounding area. But the PM, the particulate matter levels are low because obviously the developed countries have a very good control over the reduction, the emission, because of the emission standards they have for all those vehicles, and the land cover where they don't want to leave the soil exposed. If you have the land is covered with grass or something, then you avoid the resuspension of those particles from the open soil crust. New York is 96th in terms of the pollution, but again, you have a lot of population, but the pollution level is low. Delhi and Calcutta are the most highly polluted cities. The blood lead levels, lead is again lead in children can cause a reduction in IQ and also can affect the nervous system, brain development, and things like that. The blood lead levels in children in Delhi is around 20 to 60 microgram per deciliter, and this is 2 times higher than the World Health Organization limit, which is 10 microgram per deciliter. So the lead levels are very high in Indian children. And India has, as I mentioned before, 60% of the heart disease patients worldwide. The air pollution is one of the culprits behind the heart diseases. There are many studies, even studies from University of Michigan and Michigan State University have shown that the particulate matter, they have done studies in Detroit to show that high levels of particulate matter, there is a direct connection with hospital admission for heart-related diseases. There are certain times in a year you have particulate matter levels are very high in air, and that particular time of the year you see a lot of hospital admissions related to heart diseases. And there are many studies from London and many such things, very unequivocal evidence. Another problem with India is not only in urban areas but also in rural areas because of this type of clay stove chullas used to burn biomass. This is basically, this is the kind of stoves used in cooking, indoor environment. Sometimes there are no windows or doors, and you use this biomass and produce a lot of particles, PAHs. The women who are spending a lot of time cooking, they get exposed to these compounds. This has been very extensively studied in India for the last 20 years. And many non-governmental organizations have come up with some developments to reduce the smoke and particulate inside the house. So they basically developed or implemented a chute so that the smoke can go out of the house. So there are some new models that have come up recently. So still over 100 million households in India use such stoves, and it's a major source of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and particulate matter in the indoor environment. Pregnant women, increase the risk of premature and stillbirth when they are exposed to these kinds of toxic materials in air. And in urban environment, the vehicular pollution is the major cause for particulate matter. This is the data from Hyderabad, again published in a journal. About 20 to 30% of the particulate matter is from the vehicles in urban areas. Then water pollution. So that's about air pollution. So basically, the Indian rivers are dying. It's being choked with lots of materials, waste, solid waste, and also the liquid or the sewage dumped directly into the rivers. For instance, in the Yamuna River, a tributary of the Ganges River in Delhi, 3 billion liters of waste are pumped into the river, and in most cases untreated waste. And there are no wastewater treatment facilities, but the government has spent about $400 million in the last 15-20 years under the Ganga Action Plan, at least for those cities located along the Ganges River basin, to have sewage treatment plants. But it's not really, it's a Ganga sometimes inaction plan because it's not working. And in fact, I was there last July, working with some of those people who are working on the Ganges pollution for a long time. And unfortunately, the people drink the same water. The Ganges River near Varanasi has a fecal coliform levels of 3,000% higher than what is considered safe for bathing. And the EPA limit for E. coli in recreational water, water meant for swimming, is 26 counts per milliliter. But the Ganges River water has a lot of fecal coliforms because the untreated sewage is directly discharged into the river. The Ganges Basin is a home for more than 400 million Indians. So 1/3 of the Indian population is in the Ganges River Basin. So if you can keep the Ganges Basin safe and secure, it can save a lot of people. That's the reason why the government has been doing something to to clean the Ganges River. It is 2,500 kilometers long, and it originates from its glacial source in the Himalayas. So it's called third pole. Like Arctic and Antarctic, you have the third pole on the top. Glaciers, lots of glaciers, and now it's melting because of the global warming. And it's very pristine, but by the time it reaches Varanasi and Patna, you see that lots of waste are dumped, and only 1/3 of the sewage generated by the towns and cities located along the mainstream of the river is treated because of the Ganga Action Plan. But again, still 2/3 of the wastewater is not treated. Again, this is another study published from India recently. It was all in newspaper, TV in India. It has attracted a lot of media attention. Ganga is now a deadly source of cancer. That's what the study says. It was out in October 2012. So again, it's a population level study. Lot of people living along the Ganges River have lots of different types of cancer. And they are directly associating that to drinking water from the Ganges River. It's a holy river for Indians, Hindus. Unfortunately, this is what is happening now. So again, with regard to the river pollution, 90% of the water throughout the country is discharged untreated, and it contributes to 2.2 million deaths every year, mainly because of the diarrheal diseases. I told you the E. coli, the coliform bacteria. People, you take bath there and get exposed to this bacteria, results in diarrhea, and then, the young children are susceptible for such kinds of exposures. And 1.8 million children younger than 5 years of this die of diarrheal diseases because they are very vulnerable to exposure to those coliform bacteria. Combined with industrial runoff, the garbage thrown into the river totals about 3 billion liters of waste per day. So again, I have been working on some of these problems in India for about 20 years. Since the time I went to Japan, I have been contacted by some interested scientists. They have no access to analyze some of these chemicals. I told you, if you have to analyze dioxins, one of the most toxic chemicals, Titabawasi River, Saginaw River is known for dioxin pollution. One sample is $2,000. And of course, you need to have a very well-equipped lab, very expensive instrumentation. We use, for instance, in my lab, I have about 6 LC-MS MSs. Each one costs about $500,000. So you need to have a lot of money to have that infrastructure available, and we don't have it in India even today, unfortunately. So again, this study was conducted in the 1994. Ganges River dolphin. Ganges River has dolphins. There are only 5 river dolphins in the world. 5 species of river dolphins, sorry. And one of them is the Ganges River dolphin, very endemic. You can't find this species anywhere else in the world. And the Chinese river dolphin, the Yangtze River dolphin, already is extinct because the river is very vulnerable for all this pollution. And and these animals are very sensitive. Once you pollute the system, they can, of course, there is a lot of other pressure, the habitat destruction and population pressure, all these can contribute to it, but the chemical exposure can aggravate the problem. So the Yangtze River dolphin is extinct. Now they have officially declared, in fact, this year, they declared that it is no more. They used to have lots of those dolphins, river dolphins in the Yangtze River in China. Indus River dolphin, in Pakistan, they have about 200 dolphins left. Just 200, you can count them. The Ganges River dolphin, in 1994, when we started this study, we had 5,000 animals. So this year I talked to Professor Sinha, who is called Dolphin Man of India, because he spent all his life trying to save this dolphin. He made the Indian government make stamps and many things. He did so many things to help protect this dolphin. Now he says that we have 2,500 dolphins. But at least they're doing something to, create awareness among the people, fishermen and things like that. So we were looking at some of the toxic chemicals in these dolphins, if they can be contributing to some of the problems for their declining population. You can see the DDT, It's a pesticide used in agriculture and also for public health purposes. Several thousand nanogram per gram in their body. You can find hexachlorocyclohexane, PCBs, which are used in transformers and capacitors, chlordanes, hexachlorobenzene. You can find many pesticides, that are used in agriculture. They get biomagnified in the food chain. So through the runoff, these chemicals are very persistent. They don't break down. The United States banned PCBs from production 40 years ago, in the 1970s. DDT was banned in the United States in the 1970s, 1973. But these chemicals are still being used in developing countries because they are very cheap and very effective against mosquitoes. So, the developing countries are thinking about effectiveness and very cheap, at cheap cost. Unfortunately, the US banned, many Western countries banned that because of its persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity. The bald eagle population in the United States was decimated in the 1960s. The United States used to have 100,000 pairs of bald eagles in the beginning of the century, in 1900. And then in 1965, they had only 100 pairs. And Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, clearly documented how DDT affected these bird populations. And then US banned DDT in the 1973, and then now the bald eagle population is on the rise. We have more than 10,000 bald eagle pairs in the United States. So there is a clear link between the usage of some of these chemicals and effects on wildlife. And countries like India still continue to use some of these compounds. The other problem now, the Ganges River Basin, is arsenic pollution. You might be hearing a lot about arsenic in Bangladesh. And same is true in India, especially in West Bengal, Bihar areas. For instance, I think it was 2 years or last year, 18 babies in villages in Bihar were born blind. And they were all drinking water from one well, one particular well in a village. And then it was found out that that well had extremely high levels of arsenic. Maybe 1,000 times above the WHO limit, several thousand times probably. And now, there are many studies going on in India looking at arsenic problem, how aggravated it is, and what they should do to do that. So in the UP, Uttar Pradesh, the Ganges Basin, 4,780 tube wells were analyzed for arsenic, and 46% of the wells had more than 10 microgram per liter of arsenic, which is the WHO recommended value. And 26% had more than 50 microgram per liter, and 10% had more than 300 microgram per liter, and some wells had as high as 3,000 microgram per liter. Very, very high levels of arsenic. So 11 affected villages revealed typical arsenic skin lesions ranging from melanosis and keratosis. These are the things you can find in arsenic affected populations. All the skin, it's a very typical symptom, very well associated. If you see something like that, it is because of arsenic. And then there are some studies conducted in India looking at arsenic in hair, because hair can be a very good indicator of arsenic exposures. So, and also the nails, fingernails. You can take nails and measure arsenic. So these are some of the values. This is arsenic levels in hair, arsenic levels in nails. These are mean, median, minimum, maximum values here. So percentage of samples having arsenic values above the normal threshold value, 75%, 95%, 94%. So people in that Ganges River Basin have very high levels of arsenic exposure. And this is the control population, the population that is not exposed to arsenic. They are away from some of these groundwater sources of arsenic. They are taking water from other places. They have lower levels. So clearly there is a link. Then other problem is the solid waste disposal. We don't have a very organized solid waste disposal facility in India. So the country generates over 5,000, the country with over 5,000 cities and towns generating about 40 million tons of municipal solid waste per year. It's a lot of waste, solid waste. Sometimes they are dumped along the street side, and you can see cows and buffaloes grazing the waste, pigs, and sometimes they are disposed on the street side or some on the outskirts of small towns or villages. There are, for big cities like Chennai, there are some dump yards. The problem is that the people set fire in those dump yards so that they can recover some metal waste. And there are some people who sustain their lives based on the recovery of materials from those dump yards. They set fire. For instance, this is one location in Chennai, about 140 hectares area. A lot of waste dumped every day, and the people set fire, and then that results in the formation of dioxins. Dioxins, as I mentioned before, very toxic chemicals, and people have no idea what this smoke can contain, and exposure to this smoke can lead to what kind of problem, unfortunately, lack of awareness. So we have been doing some studies on these kinds of problems in India. So we have been measuring dioxins in people living nearby the landfill or waste dump sites, and also the milk from cows, buffaloes, and also we took meat from the pigs to see if these animals are exposed to dioxins, and then also human milk, breast milk, because people living along that area nearby all these dump yards, we collected breast milk. We calculated exposure of newborn babies through breastfeeding to these toxic chemicals like dioxins. So this is a study looking at soil, contamination of soil from the dumping sites. And we also had some control sites which are away from the dump yards, like farm soils. Actually, some of our studies not just focused only on India. In fact, we in our lab, we are interested in all the Asian countries, South and Southeast Asian countries as a whole, because this problem is not just limited to India. So we want to see some pattern of what's going on in those countries where no studies exist, because sometimes it's interesting and to see what's really happening in those countries. Here in the United States and Western European countries, we pay a lot of attention to this problem. Government is spending millions and millions of dollars, to take care of this problem. Otherwise, the people make a cry, the taxpayers, what are you doing to protect our environment? Whereas in developing countries, like India, there is no such a thing. They have no idea what's going on and to what chemicals they are exposed and what that will do to the people. So you can see here, this is for India dumping site. The mean value of dioxin is 7,400 picogram per gram, and this value is similar to what you find in the Titabawasi River, especially the Titabawasi River watershed. Again, this is a study I conducted when I was at Michigan State. Dow Chemical is one of the sources of, or probably the major source of dioxins in that river. They were producing many chlorinated pesticides that resulted in the formation of these dioxins. And as I mentioned before, the breast cancer rate, there are many public health-related studies have been conducted by University of Michigan and MSU. Clearly, very high level, one of the most highly dioxin contaminated sites in the country, in the United States.
This is not a time when I want to stop listening to you now that you're coming back close to here. But
yes,
5 minutes.
Yes, I will try to wrap this up in 5 minutes. So anyway, so you can clearly see that the levels of these dioxins are very high in soils from those dump sites in India. Again, there are no studies. It is impossible to analyze these kinds of samples in India. So we go there, collect samples, and we have published many of these studies, just in the interest of providing information, what's out there.
On that chart, you have two numbers on there. You have an upper scale sodium and a lower scale. What is the difference?
This one, this.
400 versus 33.
Oh, this is the control site. The site away from the dumping yard. So these are like farm soils far away from the dump sites. Again, the cow, buffaloes feeding on those locations, we take milk, and this is the dumping site, the concentrations of dioxins in milk. And the dioxin values are expressed in TEQs, toxic equivalents. So by drinking the cow or buffalo milk, you are exposed to 1.1 to 6 picogram TEQ per kilogram body weight per day. The WHO limit is 4, maximum 4. They usually recommend 1 to 4. 1 is for the babies and so on. But here we are almost, just by drinking milk from those cows and buffaloes feeding in those dump yards, you can be exposed to these dioxins at a level that can be a problem to your health, because dioxins are carcinogenic. And these are the values from the control site. Of course, the levels are lower than that in dump sites. Again, we collected some samples of pigs, and also we measured thyroid hormone levels in the blood. We collected blood samples from the pigs. So obviously, very high levels of dioxins in dump site in relation to control site, and the thyroid hormone levels are much lower in those pigs that were exposed to high levels of dioxins, because dioxins can interfere with thyroid hormone levels. As I mentioned before, thyroid hormone is very important for metabolism and brain development. We also collected human milk, breast milk. Of course, these are for different countries. The top one is for India. The yellow bar is for the dump site, and the pink one is for the control site. Clearly, the levels are very high in women living in and around the dump site. We compared, because the babies feed this are breastfed, and we calculated babies' exposure to these toxic chemicals, toxic equivalents of dioxins, HCHs, a pesticide, and DDTs. And these are some of the tolerable daily intake values for babies, infants. And you can see for TEQs, all above the tolerable daily intake value recommended by the World Health Organization. So the babies are dosed with these toxic chemicals through breastfeeding. I think I'm going to skip this because we also have e-waste problem, and the e-waste has a lot of dioxins and other things. We have also done some studies, again in the 1990s, looking at HCHs, DDTs in blood of people. If you take blood, these are the values for Indians, 30 to 40 microgram per liter of blood. You have these pesticides. In comparison with the Mexicans and the US population in the 1990s, US you can see almost nothing, no HCH. DDT is very, very low, less than 1 microgram per liter, whereas in India it is 30 to 40 microgram per liter. So it's almost 100 times higher in India, Indian blood. And obviously the foodstuffs are contaminated, the dairy products, because these chemicals get concentrated in milk, and when you make butter or cheese from the milk, you concentrate the chemical, because these chemicals like to be in lipids. So you concentrate the chemical, and when you take the dairy products like butter or cheese, you have very high levels of these chemicals. In ppm level, parts per million level, which is very high, 3 microgram per gram of the product. And obviously by ingesting those contaminated foods, you can be exposed to very high levels of pesticides. So this is the acceptable or daily intake of DDT and HCHs by Indians, 10 to 100 times higher than those found for other developed countries like UK or USA, Australia, and so on. Again, we have the same problem with DDT, HCH, and dioxins. These are the 3 chemicals that are very prominent in India at this point. PCBs are not very high because, as I told you, PCBs are mainly used in industrial materials. India is not an industrial country. So, for instance, you can see the breast milk levels of PCBs are much lower in India than in developed countries like Japan or Canada or Sweden, because developed countries, obviously, the industrial development. So you have this industrial chemical predominant in the breast milk. This is only 2 more slides. these are some of the emerging chemicals, the phthalates, which are used in many plastic products. These are modern chemicals. I call them modern chemicals. DDT, HCH are all old chemicals. DDT was started to be produced since World War II because they were very good pesticides. So for increasing agricultural production, controlling malaria and plague, DDT was produced and used. But the phthalates are new products. With the modernization, we have all these new materials coming up in all the plastics. These are used as plasticizers to make the plastic very flexible, like baby toys contain phthalates. And these are reproductive toxicants. So we are also measuring these chemicals in people from many countries. Again, this is one of our recent study. These chemicals are excreted in urine, so we basically take urine samples, and you can find these chemicals. And the levels are similar to what you find in the United States, Kuwait. And you can also see the pattern very similar between the US, Kuwait, and India. The red bar is ethyl phthalate, which is used in many fragrances. When people use fragrances, that has ethyl phthalate. You are exposed to ethyl phthalate. So these three countries have a very unique pattern. You can see that in China, Korea, Japan, the red bar is not that predominant. It is predominantly the pink bar here, which is diethyl phthalate, used in many vinyl flooring material, PVC pipes, and so on. So using some of these patterns, we can tell where the sources of exposures are from. And also, among different populations, you can tell how they are resembling each other in terms of culture, usage of some of the fragrances and things like that can lead to certain type of exposures. I also talked about bisphenol A, a new chemical used in many polycarbonate. The baby bottle is polycarbonate material. In Canada, they already banned bisphenol A. But again, you can find these chemicals in India and in many other countries, the level similar to what you find in the United States. So this is the one slide I wanted to talk about, the recent project we have on the pharmaceuticals in Indian waters. Many antibiotics, penicillin, streptomycin, you can find that in the river waters. Actually, we were collecting samples from the Ganges River in Patna. And of course, there are some articles came out from our work, preliminary work. We find very high levels of these pesticides or antibiotics and drugs, and also New Delhi metallo bacteria. It's a bacteria that causes. It's a gene that causes resistance to antibiotics in bacteria, and especially this is for the bacteria that causes pneumonia. So people have a pneumonia infection. If you are inflicted with this bacteria, there is no remedy. The antibiotics that is commonly given will not work. That has become a serious problem now. And now we have started this project this year, and I have many colleagues. This is Professor Sinha. He will be visiting me in February for 3 months. Dr. Yamashita, my colleague, he was my classmate when I was doing my PhD, so we are collaborating now. Some of my German colleagues were also partners in that project. So what can we do? Again, in my opinion, creating public awareness is very important in India. And we need to establish schools of public health. It's a great country. It's a great land for doing epidemiological studies because of the extremes we have. The rural population may not have any exposure. The urban population may have tremendous exposure. So you can compare and contrast with doing this they're doing. I would like to end this talk with the phrase, sometimes it's called Native Indian phrase, or also it's called Gandhi's phrase. We do not inherit that from our ancestors, but we borrowed it from our children. So we want to leave them at least as we received, or if not better. So with that, I said enough of bad things about India, but there are very great things about India. It's a beautiful country, so I would like to leave this slide and end my talk. If you have any questions, I'll be glad.
I had started my comments initially thinking about what Shubhra's paper offered us and the kind of amazing destabilized sign that her analysis conjures for us in a way, the way that demarcated discourses of public space actually mask or bolster private logics of land use and access. It's remarkable to think about this for me, and it taps into a wider set of conundra, really, that I face in my own work. Shubhra cites Anna Singh's work on the performance of potential profit-mobilizing investment frenzies, which operate even without actual material investment. You know, Singh describes this kind of amazing domain of the venture as an adventure of speculation as wealth generation, even in the absence of infrastructure. There's a kind of magical and frightening quality to this that points me to start my comments today with a moment of reflexivity. This morning, Shubhra was in my kitchen, and she asked me, oh, how is your sister? What does your sister do? And I gave her this kind of stock answer about my sister, which I think I also gave Madison this week in another conversation, which was to say about my sister, whom I adore, oh, she makes about $360,000 a year doing research for large oil companies, to my roughly $80,000 trying to do research on them, right? So in spite of the slipperiness of these signs, the magicality of high capitalist economies, the complexity of what we do, there are some really basic incommensurate relationships that undergird a lot of the things we're talking about here. And for those of us who are variously trained in rigorous traditions of research, I want to start by asking, what do we make of this complexity and these enormously incommensurate things, right? What kinds of frames and tactics do we need to develop in the face of these kinds of puzzles, which are sometimes so blatant and big as to beg questions before we even figure out how to frame them? We were all forewarned. If we think back to our Baudrillard and French theorists, you know, we knew that high capitalist structures and economies and selves would be disorienting and even dizzying to analyze, let alone to embody. But this is where the lenses of historical ecology and environmental history, for me, are so, so useful. And these papers each contain elements of that. Continued attention to shifts over time, efforts to define eras or epochs, crucial intellectual tools for place-based interrogations of changing relationships, not just between urban and rural worlds, but between new kinds of sectors, and even between meanings and materiality itself, which is, of course, a dualism that's false and that we're never done redefining. This is a very personal point. Again, this morning, Shubhra and I lamented the scarcity of time in our lives to do field research. Mark's slides kept showing us different aged sons tagging along, whether it was fun for them or not. Kannan's work confesses to scattered scampling in Indian sites because of limited resources and limited time on the ground and limited colleagues to conduct that research. So I just want to focus for a moment on a question, which is that one I raised a moment ago. What are the hardest choices that we make as scholars and teachers and citizens about how and where and with what methods and approaches we engage these questions of alienation or privatization or contamination? The fact that this panel contains voices from traditional disciplines as well as from professional schools is very heartening to me for obvious reasons, with a teaching load partly in anthropology and partly in a school of environment. I want to congratulate the people that organized the panel for that. It sets this conversation apart from far too many, I think, of the scholarly conversations unfolding right now on these kinds of issues. I also simply want to raise one or two more points before we move on. And I had done a little bit more work tacking back and forth between Indian environments and African ones where I work. In particular, I had pointed to the scholarship of James Ferguson, whose work Global Shadows chronicles neoliberalism on the African continent and points to the differences between the thick relationships that existed in post-colonial industry in newly independent African states starting in the 1960s with their labor relations and labor unions, and the thinner ones that characterize post-liberalized governments in Africa with offshore oil industries, precious earth mineral supply chains with very little transformation on the ground going into the making of objects like this. I will collapse and sort of just flag those comments for you in the interest of time. But I did want to make the point that there are some really important parallels, I think, between the debates going on in Africanist circles, and Jennifer Wenzel, who's sitting among us, is better positioned than most of us to think across these regions and these communities about these questions. I think it's very fruitful to do that. Certainly, the loss of thick interaction, of rich patron-client relationships at the regional scale, of contestations between labor unions and management in African contexts, which Ferguson sort of laments in some of his work, is not something that isn't meaningful to those of us sitting here in Michigan, right? I mean, thin social relationships of responsibility leave little room for the improvement of lives of workers and their families, and that is not a foreign notion to people sitting in Michigan in today's economy, where concerns with organized auto labor, outsourcing, and negative environmental impacts that Kannan raised in his paper are very, very much on our plates. But I want to remind us that there are crucial differences between our context and the one of India if we are to contrast the rulings about the BP oil spill in our Gulf of Mexico with those made about Bhopal in India. And I just want to briefly touch on that because I think it's an important thing to bear in mind, right? BP this week, one of the most remarkable rulings in the history of the United States, right? One of the biggest fines to be levied against a corporation for environmental damage and neglect ever to have happened. I think $4.5 billion are going to be paid here. That's a really remarkable contrast with the belated and overrated and hotly debated court decision in India, once again last year regarding the Bhopal disaster, in which the companies implicated, Union Carbide and Dow, have continued contesting payments even at much, much lower levels in the millions of dollars. Indeed, just last June, Bloomberg Media reported that a Manhattan appeals court has ruled, quote, that not only is the plaintiff's claim dismissed against Union Carbide Company, but we've also clarified that Union Carbide has no liability related to the plant site, and further acknowledges that the matter of site ownership and liability is the responsibility of the state government of Madhya Pradesh. That is a bag that the Indian state is left holding. And as our last paper notes, in a very different kind of case than the beautiful case made by anthropologist Kim Fortune's work on the Bhopal disaster. This set of issues is unlikely to be dealt with in ways that can shed light on whether or not current health problems in that region are traceable to past travesties or maybe related to contemporary transitions. There's not the public health and policy knowledge base in India to do that well. So the contrast is especially poignant and striking with the Gulf of Mexico BP decision, in which only 11 manslaughter charges for men killed on those platforms has resulted in such a high fine. Meanwhile, Union Carbide and Dow keep rolling their eyes heavenward, and they remind us that Amnesty International's estimates of 7,000 killed immediately and 15,000 deaths later from related injuries and illnesses are just wrong. Anyway, what happened in the medium to long term can't be their problem. And the bottom line is it was only 3,800 instant deaths. So could we stop making mountains out of molehills, right? And finally, speaking of mountains, I just want to touch on one more thing, which is about, in both Mark's and Shubhra's papers, and indeed the last one, this question of submerged pastoralisms, which for me strikes a chord. Mark's paper contains elements of optimism, actually, that pick up on my colleague Aiwa Ong's insistence that we look for exceptions to neoliberalism, although she talks more about the level of zoning, and you're talking more about institutions and social formations, which I really appreciated. But both in Gurgaon and in the Himachal Pradesh cases that you raised, I found really haunting these recurrent images of a few brave, ragged individuals still moving between mountaintops and valleys with animals, or maybe foraging in what's left of the Gurgaon landscape. Richard's question earlier kind of poked at that in your paper, like, well, are there other groups other than Dalit doing any foraging? Not so much. Food gatherers of Gurgaon is a long way off, right, for those of us who live in Ann Arbor. And Shubhra reminds us through her use of work by Amita Bhaviskar and others that much more bourgeois modalities characterize the dominant environmental concerns at this time in the Delhi peri-urban zone. But they're undergirded by far more Gundar-like levels of violent crimes against Dalits, which reminds us of, again, what Jennifer Wenzel's work on South Africa has identified as this violence that can erupt when what she calls a pastoral promise meets political imperatives. So there's this, submerged pastoralist question, which is actually laced with enormous violence. And in my own work in Eastern and Southern Africa, or Tom Bassett's work on pastoralists in West Africa, there's a lot of documentation right now about how they are modifying their identities. They are finding narrow and more flexible corridors for mobility. They're redefining alliances. I'm watching right now the former colonial reserves in Kenya and South Africa turn into timeshares where people can have sundowner cocktails on these fabulous new terraces and watch the chimpanzees play. So I really do feel terrified about the havoc that propertied environmentalism can wreak on a commons or on uncommonly wild areas with histories of low human density. And that's one of the biggest of the incommensurate points, the mobility of people who still are mobile resource users in some way versus the agility of multinational corporations hopping across borders or shifting even their identities from Dow to Union Carbide. What's a judge to do, right? I do see pastoralists taking notes. The group I work with in South Africa, the Royal Bafokeng, have incorporated. They are traditionally governed, but they are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. They are, they have maneuvered for generations to have land rights that tap into the profit of one of the largest platinum veins on the planet. And they are in regular meetings with the Seminole Indian Nation here since they purchased the Hard Rock Cafe franchise, Jessica Catalino's work. So I want to urge us as well, though, to think about, the difference perhaps between some subsistence niches or caste identities as ones that are more capable of building new platforms for action and asserting citizenship in ways that kind of appropriate corporate forms, or even the kinds of landscapes and bourgeois environmentalisms you're describing. That's something that I'm fascinated by and curious about, and it gives me a bit of hope of a kind, I think, that relates a bit to what Mark is talking about at the end of his talk. The leadership of the Royal Bafokeng is challenged by pushback from people who see that their mining revenues are ruining what used to be protein-rich grasslands for cattle. And so, to close, I'll just say that this area where I work, once known for unique high-protein grass species that were really well suited to nourishing cattle, has been transformed beyond recognition by mining, and maybe even beyond redefinition as pastoral land again. So that's the restoration ecology question too. Like, what kinds of damage are really undoable in what sense? The wild proliferation of discourses about development and conservation and the new variation of landscapes of profit and leisure and patrimony belies a narrowing of actual ecological options and economic options, and maybe even a narrowing of health and longevity for future generations of those children, if we're to take your paper quite seriously. So that seems especially cruel in an increasingly volatile world where we seem to be learning too late that livelihoods deemed less aesthetically or economically desirable actually may hold crucial keys to adaptation under circumstances like climate extremes, which we have difficulty predicting or understanding or deflecting, but which all three of your papers make clear are being exacerbated by current configurations of technology and profit and transformation. So thanks for listening.
Now it's open to anyone to jump into the conversation, not necessarily with a question. Because I'm sure the great richness of the discussion this afternoon will be reverberating in every mind in this room at this point, in one way or another. Bill.
Is the bottled water from a ganja?
I was just thinking, what toxins have I just exposed myself to? Oh my God.
Standards for bottled water are lower than the standards for city water. Interesting. But we think because it's in a sealed bottle, that it's better. But I will ask you a question about India. Diabetes, I think of as a Western disease caused by, eating a lot of high carbohydrates and sugars and things like this. Why is the diabetes level in India so high?
I mean, two factors. Of course, nutrition is one of the important factors. It depends on what you eat, the carb diet. And the environmental factors can contribute to diabetes as well. The dioxin exposure has been very clearly, unequivocally linked to diabetes. And when we started this work, we thought that when we started that work on dioxins, we thought that dioxins are, chemicals of Western countries, we won't be seeing anything in India. But out of curiosity, we tried and we were surprised. And we didn't even know, in the first paper, we didn't even have an explanation why it's high. But we know that it's high. Then, after unraveling many things like using chullas, the biofuel mass inside the home, and backyard burning of all this, waste, garbage waste, contributes to exposure. So the air is contaminated with dioxins.
The diet in India, I think, has a large amount of vegetables, is it not?
It is.
Most people eat vegetables.
It is.
And usually, people who eat vegetables don't usually get
No, but ghee clarified butter.
Right.
Pure death.
I mean, that's why, again, we did another study looking at levels of DDT and HGHs in vegetarian breast milk and non-vegetarian breast milk. You would expect high levels in non-vegetarian breast milk because they eat meat, and you would expect they concentrate high levels of these chemicals and obviously exposed to high levels of these compounds, so the breast milk will have high levels of DDT or HGHs. We found very high levels in vegetarian breast milk. And then later we found out that the vegetarians take a lot of ghee, the dairy products, to compensate for the protein.
The other question I have would be related to the fact that you seem to have a lot of industrial pollutants in the water, yet you also told about how India has very little industry in the country.
Yes.
So where are all these
The industries are kind of localized. It's not widespread. It's not as intensive as in Japan or Korea or China. For instance, in India, Gujarat is industrially very well developed, and it's developing. All the industries are in Gujarat now. But again, there are some sporadic locations and there is no treatment. They just directly dump these toxic chemicals into the waste without any treatment that causes pollution.
I'd also like to ask Professor Kannan. Thank you for that very interesting talk. I was stunned to hear that there are no public health schools in India. This is completely, and sort of the knowledge blackout, was the big message of your talk. I have a simple question. Where did you do that testing, and whose instrumentation did you use?
It's in my lab,
with those dolphins, did you fly those dolphins all the way to
We take
Albany?
the tissues, and usually, some of these are endangered species, so you are not allowed to take the tissues. So what we do, of course, I have collaborators in India, and we ask them to extract. Usually you have to extract the tissue with some organic solvent to extract all the toxic chemicals, and the extract is sent to our lab, further purified, and the instrumentation is the most expensive piece in that whole process.
But don't you need horrid degrees of paperwork under the CITES agreement
sure.
and so forth? Is this
You have
really
to get all these
possible?
permits. It's a very tedious process, and it's becoming more and more difficult now with the human samples. You cannot transport human specimens, between countries.
I can speak loud. What's the level of contamination of fish or shellfish consumed in India? Are they? You never touched that. Sea products.
We have done a lot of work, but I just, because of the time, I didn't want to go in detail. Obviously, the seafood consumption in India is much, much lower than many other countries. I think the daily consumption rate is 15 grams per day. So although the fish are contaminated because the daily ingestion rate is much lower, they are not, in total, they are not contributing much to the exposure.
Only coastal area.
I mean, West Bengal, they eat a lot of fish. Again, it depends on some, states.
One more, and then I'll have to close it out.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Rebecca, first of all, for her afterward and the kind of thinking between sites and context that she kind of helps to put these papers today in context, what you were saying about the thin and the thick, reminds me of my own attempts in my work to think between the Niger Delta and Michigan as spaces shaped in very different ways but related ways by what gets called in Nigeria petroviolence, right? We might not think of Michigan as shaped by petroviolence, but I think it is. And so thinking about Dow, which came up again and again in terms of the Tidabuasi, but connecting that back to Bhopal, I think is really a helpful thing to have said, particularly when, when you were talking, Professor Kannan, about, it's not like that here in the U.S. You have protections and your government wants to take care of you. And I kept thinking, well, that's not exactly how it is. That's
at least there is some awareness. That's what I wanted to say.
Right. It's awareness, but it's been hard won, those protections. Right. And so I think the question is how can those protections be hard won elsewhere? But I wanted to follow up with Professor Gururani on the questions of pastoralism, actually, because you said something really interesting in response to Lee Schlesinger and Dalit women and the campaign of rapes against them being connected to contests over land. And I'm wondering about how you can think about that phenomenon in connection with the man who's so proud of his park and talking about, needing to keep the gundas out, basically, so it feels like a kind of pastoral move, right, that he's making that ignores other kinds of violence at stake. And then I was really interested theoretically in your closing move, talking about the limits of the ontological turn and, the kind of much richer account of materiality and agency that it offers us, but the ways in which it's evacuated politically. And that's something that really resonates with concerns that I have. So I'm really hoping that you can just say a little more about that to help me think through similar conundrums.
Thank you. I guess the two big questions. Can you hear that? Okay. The comment I made about land. I'm trying to still figure out this particular place, and I think, Rebecca, thank you for those really evocative comments, because how to think of, I've done field work in Himalayas, a very different context, a very different place, where they have a very long colonial history of dispossession and control in a very different way, and then how to think of Gurgaon, another kind of accumulation and dispossession, which is very different. So not just across continents, but two regions, two different histories, two different agrarian contexts. So it's been a challenge, and what to make sense of it. And I think somewhere I'm coming back to the question of land over and over again, and this whole question of speculation, which, what is it about land, and what is it that this kind of violence and evacuation and eviction, which is taking place in places like Gurgaon, I don't think is limited to Gurgaon, and which is very gendered, extremely, and speaks to a particular place which is very feudal. Gurgaon has very deeply embedded structures of caste. And how to think of this very gendered, caste-based violence. So these rapes have been against Dalit women. And what is it about? So there's been all sorts of weird explanations. And I'm thinking that this is about Dalits making claims on land, and this is a way of removing them from making those claims. So it's kind of a maybe simple narrative, and I haven't, but this is just a thought that what is it that is so much happening around gendered bodies. So that's one, just thinking, and I think what you say that, yes, on the one hand, these advocates, that's propertied environmentalisms, which are going on. On the one hand, I don't want to dismiss these kind of efforts, right? I'm also one of those who participates in these contradictory practices. So what is it? What motivates them, and how they conflict and compete and yet carry on? So how to take these environmentalisms, on the one hand, serious, but also having very serious implications for some. And so that's, yes, the pastoral motive, I think I need to go back to think what they do. The second question, I have been troubled, and I think there's something which troubles me about species meeting. I like it. I teach it myself, and I've been quite energized to think about how to think about it through work of, how to think of democracy through the politics of nature. And I think it's very useful, and I've been engaging with that set of debates because it's really forces us to think about questions of agency and agency in a very different, evocative, emergent way. So I think there is something to it. But I think that work has largely been, has a very particular geophysical, geoeconomic focus, I think, refers to, and also looks specifically at and I'm here referring to, people like Donna Haraway, dog lovers, nature lovers, who are looking at particular kind of scientists, particular kinds of dog owners, etc., and their love for it. But what happens to ordinary pastoralists or these ordinary villagers? They are not seen as agents really in this picture. So really been thinking about ordinary everyday activity and agency, which we need to think of their materiality as well. And the question of who speaks at the end of the day still is up in the air. And we have skirted away from that, and I think returned to back to questions of environmental ethics, and how to think about questions of politics has been, what does politics means when you begin to think about sort of a distributive agency, everybody is participating, it's all emergent, matter. And so here, thinking of the park and this particular landscape as a matter of concern. And what makes it a matter of concern? Why has it brought together this very large assemblage of people who have not very clear overlaps in interest? Some very clear. One can say these are property environmentalists who are making claims and hoping for the land value to go up, and they're speculating, and so are the villagers speculating, and hence not resisting. There's been no resistance, but it's also thinking about the consensus building that is going on, and this consensus is generating a very different kind of agency, which goes back to me thinking about questions of accumulation all over again. So, yeah.
All of this shows again why I am so very reluctant to have to close the afternoon's discussion. Two very brief comments. The first is a reminder, if you can possibly take a minute before you head out the door to fill in one of these evaluation forms. They are really very important to the center's capacity to demonstrate to the people higher in the hierarchy of this university the breadth of participation that we have in the center's programs. Second is just thanks to the three of you for the remarkable richness of material you've brought, and thanks to anyone who has participated in the last 9 months in these discussions on India's environment.